Yeah, I say go ahead.
Hello all, welcome to our April 2022 community call. Our topic today is writing to ORCID records. Before we start, we want to let you know about some of our logistics for today. The agenda is available online. We will share that agenda link via chat all throughout our conversation today. Your microphone is muted for now, so feel free to use the chat function for questions and comments during the presentation. The slides and recording of this call will be shared to all of you via email. We will also share the agenda and other notes of this call. Finally, closed captioning is enabled on this call. If needed, please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. We also would like to remind you of our community call norms. In this space, we strive to engage in respectful discussion. Also, please ask questions and seek clarification on our discussion throughout this hour. We also ask that you be receptive to feedback from others and on this call, and of course with any of our events. We follow the Lyricist Code of Conduct. I think all of you, if not most of you, are already familiar with our faces. So Sheila Raven is here, our program leader for Persistent Identifier Communities, and me, Paolo Guhilde, ORCID US Community Specialist. We will be on hand throughout this call. We are also joined by the team at Stanford University, who will be talking about their work on this topic. With that, I'll hand it over to Sheila, and she will lead us to our discussion today.
Great, thanks, Paolo. Okay, so before I go into kind of an overview about writing to ORCID, I do have a quick poll. I'm going to launch it right now, and it's a multiple choice question. We're basically just trying to find out of everyone on the call what your kind of status is in terms of writing data to ORCID records at your organization. And if you don't know, that's fine. Just put the I don't know answer. Okay, it looks like it's relatively evenly distributed amongst all of the options. Almost everybody has done the poll, but it looks like, yeah, it's pretty even across the board in terms of if you're already writing data to ORCID records, you're planning to do it, you want to do it, but you need to figure out more logistics, or you're still trying to get started with ORCID and you're not close to being able to write data to ORCID yet, or you don't know, and that's fine too. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. So we have people from all of these different categories on the call. Let's see, share results. So I guess y'all can all see the results now in terms of who's doing what. As you can see, it's like relatively even. So that's great. We love to have people representing all of these different scenarios. So because we do have people, doing different things or at different stages with ORCID right now, the first thing that I'm going to cover today is just an overview of writing data to ORCID records using the ORCID member API and what that really means and what the different options are. So just as kind of a review or a refresher, ORCID US community member organizations have access to 5 ORCID member API keys. API stands for Application Programming Interface, and the ORCID API can basically be used to pull data out of people's ORCID records, so reading data from ORCID, and or writing data to ORCID records. And you'll see there's a link to the slides in the agenda document, but we have a page that lists out all of the different types of information that can be written to ORCID or conversely read from ORCID. In terms of writing data to ORCID, everything on the ORCID record can be added by your organization using the API, except for the bio. So the biography statement, only the individual researcher can add that to their own ORCID record. Everything else, your organization can theoretically add to your researchers' ORCID records for them. So there's a couple of different options for writing data to ORCID records using the API. The first one is the ORCID Affiliation Manager tool, which is a relatively new option that is available to all ORCID US community members. You do have to, if you want to use the ORCID Affiliation Manager, it's basically an interface that you can activate through your member portal so that you can basically upload a CSV file with information that you want to add to people's ORCID records. And then there's kind of a process where you send out emails to all your researchers, they click a link to approve that connection, and then the data that you uploaded in the CSV file gets added to their ORCID record. So that's a little bit more of like a low technical barrier way to add information to ORCID records. Right now, it only adds affiliations, so like education, employment, invited positions, those kinds of things. And you do have to use one of your organization's 5 member API keys to activate it. There's a form that you can fill out if you want to use it. You just fill out this form and it will activate it. It will appear in your ORCID member portal. And so that's one option. We're not going to go into depth with this option today because we're planning on having a call later this year where we're really going to go more in depth with the Affiliation Manager tool and also hopefully hear from organizations that have already started using it. But just know that this is one option. And this wonderful graphic Paolo created kind of walks you through the different steps of the Affiliation Manager workflow. So I encourage you to just take a look at that. It's more of a graphic approach to understanding the Affiliation Manager. Now, the second option for writing data to ORCID, some vendor systems already have that ability built in. So I've listed here some examples of different software that have the ability to add data to people's ORCID records built into the software, as well as what type of information they each can add to ORCID records. So if you're using a vendor system that has these capabilities, or there's some open source systems like OJS or DMP tool, for example, you can leverage that functionality, typically using one of your member API keys in that system. And that kind of makes it easy for you because then you don't have to really worry about what's going on in the back end. Your vendor system just kind of does it for you. So that's another thing to be aware of. And we do have a list of common systems that goes into detail about what each system does or doesn't do with ORCID and what the possibilities are. So that's kind of the second option for writing data to ORCID. The third option, and the one that we're going to really focus on today, is doing a custom ORCID integration that involves adding data to your researchers' ORCID records. So any organization can do this. You would need to use one of your organization's member API keys. And you'd also need a developer basically to build the integration. So it does take some custom programming work. And some of the considerations for this is you would need to think about what kind of data you want to add to your researchers' ORCID records. Do you want to add employment information? Do you want to add works? What kind of information do you have on hand at your institution that you could add to people's ORCID records? So thinking about whether you have access to that curated, accurate data about your researchers. And then when you're thinking about that, some of that information might be stored in different units at your organization. So if you're working in the library, you might not have access to data that the research office has or that sponsored programs has if you're at a university. If you're at another type of organization, you might have other types of units that have information about your researchers. So thinking about the different stakeholders that would need to be involved based on the kind of data you want to add to ORCID records. And then another thing to think about is making sure that that information stays up to date. So for example, if you add an employment affiliation to somebody's ORCID record and they are still employed at your institution, there won't be an end date in that affiliation. But let's say that person leaves the organization, how will you add that end date? So just making sure that information at least stays as accurate as possible. And in order to add information to ORCID records, you do need to have either an XML file or a JSON file that has all of the metadata that you would need to add that information to ORCID. So ORCID has a schema for each type of data, and so you would need to figure out a process for getting the data that you have into the correct format so that you can send API calls with the XML or JSON metadata to write to ORCID. So this is just kind of an overview of the custom integration approach and some different things to think about. We do have a relatively new custom integration guide that walks through a lot more details if you're going to do a custom integration. But with kind of no further ado, oh yeah, I forgot I put this in here. This is included on our custom integration guide, but it kind of gives you another visual walkthrough of how this process would work for a custom API integration. So basically in step 1, you have a user-facing web page where your researchers go, they click on a button that allows them to create or connect their ORCID ID with your organization, with your platform. Once they click that button, you go to step 2 and the user either signs into their ORCID record or registers for an ORCID ID if they don't have one yet. And then in step 3, a little authorization box will pop up where the user authorizes that access. And kind of behind the scenes is an authorization URL, and the guide goes into a lot more detail about how that works behind the scenes. But once your users click on that authorized access button, on the back end, you'll receive this information that you're seeing over here in step 4, the person's name, their ORCID ID, and an access token, and some other information here. The access token and the ORCID ID are really the 2 most important pieces for writing data to ORCID, because then you take that information and that would be included in your API call when you're going to, either you could read data from ORCID record using that or writing data to ORCID. And if you're writing data to ORCID, you do need to use the activities update and or the person update scopes to make sure you have the correct permission. So without going into too much more technical detail, if you do have any questions about any of this, feel free to reach out to Paolo and I, and we can help you with your specific context. But hopefully this is helpful, just setting the stage for what we're going to talk about today, which is more considerations around specifically writing data to ORCID records through a custom integration. So yeah, like I mentioned, once your users go through that OAuth process, then you use the API call to write that data to ORCID. So this is just kind of an example, and there is an API tutorial on how to do that and other examples that you can see in the slides. Now, one other important thing I want to mention is that if you're writing data to ORCID records, every time you add a piece of information to an ORCID record, it has what's called a put code associated with it. If you're writing data to ORCID, you need to store those put codes somewhere. That way, if you need to go back and make a change or make an update to that piece of information that you added, you have to use the put code to identify what piece of information you're trying to change. For example, this is a API call with that put code included here. So that is returned if you're writing data to ORCID and it needs to be stored somewhere so that you have access to it later. Okay, hopefully that was helpful. We do have our featured case study to lead the discussion today, our colleagues from Stanford University. And so Tina and Daryl, I'm going to stop sharing and just let you take it from here.
Thank you, Sheila. A moment while we get the presentation shared.
Self unmuted, get myself. Tina, I can share the presentation here.
Oh, great, thank you.
All right, let me know if that's, are we looking at the first slide?
No, we're looking,
looking
at
at my
Slack.
Oh, we're looking at my Slack. That's not what we want to see.
Messages.
My conversation. All right, hold on. Switch screens.
Forget you read any of that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Let me find, hold on. Come on, Zoom, come back to me. Screen 2, there we go. That's gonna look better.
There we go.
Thank you. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to Sheila and Paolo for putting this session together. This is great. So to start, Daryl, if you can go ahead and go to the first slide for me. My name is Tina Delcont. I'm the product and program manager for the Stanford Profiles website at Stanford University and Stanford Healthcare. And I've been with Stanford and Stanford Healthcare for 9 years now. And today we want to talk a little bit about our ORCID integration that we've started thus far with Stanford Profiles and the rest of the university. So a little bit of background on the project. Starting back in what we call fiscal year 2021, or maybe prior to that in 2021, there were discussions around the university about the importance of ORCID and the growing use at Stanford. So some background on that. ORCIDs are of interest and valuable to many parts of the university: faculty, postdocs, graduate students, undergrads, academic staff, and programs and offices that support each of these groups. And some of the key indicators of its growing importance include that NIH requires ORCID IDs for all training, fellowship, and education awardees as of FY20. We have over 112 publishers that require or request ORCID IDs for their authors. There's over 22 international funders that have policies promoting the use of ORCID IDs, and then scores of research systems like Science CV, Overleaf, OpenNeuro, et cetera, that require or use ORCID IDs to enable logins, stream workflows, enhance discovery, and or reduce administration burden. So based on that, Stanford, moving forward with the growing relevance of ORCID IDs to different stakeholders on campus, and have pushed to have ORCID information available broadly. And part of this plan was identifying ORCID stakeholders at Stanford to join with the university libraries, the Dean of Research, Stanford Medicine, and University IT in what's called a Stanford ORCID stakeholder group. And part of this is to specify an enterprise architecture for integrating Stanford and ORCID systems that store ORCID information in all appropriate Stanford systems, specify an intelligent data flow across Stanford and ORCID systems, and support the best user experience by Stanford's researchers and many supporting offices. So based on that, we had a project that started in fiscal year of 2021 with the participating groups of the Dean of Research Office, our University IT middleware and integration services, Stanford University Libraries, and then our team, Stanford Profiles, to start this ORCID integration. And a little bit about Stanford Profiles. Stanford Profiles is, of course, a profile site that represents faculty, staff, and students across Stanford and other institutions to foster collaboration and community and stimulate research through the sharing of academic output and interests. Also, it represents the breadth of academic careers through the creation of rich person-centric profiles, including institutes and centers and interdepartmental program affiliations. Also, it eases faculty and administrative burdens through the use of its APIs and populating ORCID and Science CV, for example. And based on that, we started with a few features. So the first one, connecting your SUNET ID to your ORCID, handled by our Maze team, our middleware and integration services team. And it's called authorize.stanford.edu, that allows a user to connect their SUNET ID or their Stanford user ID to their ORCID through a series of screens that also allow them to set their read and write permissions. And from within Stanford Profiles, we provided that information or that link to the user, so it's integrated. So once they go into their profiles, let's say to review their publications that we automatically import for them, they have that link there that lets them click on that, go to the page, which Daryl will be showing you in a few minutes, to link their SUNET ID or set their read and write permissions for that. We also then display that ORCID information on the profile for the user in a couple of places, one being on their publication page, and it's also a link to their ORCID profile. We also have secure token storage and access API for Stanford applications. As I mentioned, the display of the ORCID, and then the latest piece that we did is that publications for profiles that are public, that have been approved by the user, that are also public and have certain identifiers, are passed automatically to ORCID, to the ORCID profile for the user, and that process runs about every 2 days. And that's our current implementation, and I'll turn it over to Daryl Diekman, one of our senior software developers, to talk through the technical pieces.
All right, hi, I'm Daryl Diekman, and I've been working on Stanford Profiles for, I guess at least 9 years, Tina, probably off and on for 9 years.
Okay.
So I'm going to go through, won't be a live demo. It'll be a couple of screenshots, try to keep things as simple as possible and leave room for discussion here at the end. I'm going to go over what the general high-level architecture is here, show some screenshots of all the bits and pieces that are on this screen here, and then talk about our experience setting this up, and then some questions that we have as we move forward into our future opportunities where we see this project, where it might head. And then so this will end with a bunch of open-ended questions to try to figure out where other people are and get input from the group. So this is the general overview. This slide is the general overview of the ORCID integration project. And it kind of lines up with the bullets that we had on the previous screen. Here at the top is Stanford Profiles. It's a huge application with lots of information about people, their publications, their memberships, their, you name it, and we probably have it in Stanford Profiles. As far as this project goes, we needed to connect that experience. We needed to use that as the gateway because many of the people on campus, they know what their Stanford profile is. That's how they're used to interacting with a lot of systems. And since Stanford Profiles has so much information about people in it, they kind of know to go there on their way to other places. So this first arrow, which was the connect your SUNET ID to your ORCID, that's where users are coming in. Since the main initiative was to connect your SUNET to your ORCID so that we could publish publications, we introduce people and encourage them to make this connection while they're reviewing their publications. And so that process is, as Sheila described, you'll come in, you'll go through an OAuth, a three-legged OAuth workflow, which I'll give you a little screenshot here in a second, just how we implemented that. And then that gets the two connected. And at that point in time, Stanford, our Stanford API, member API client is then issued a token, which we can use for 20 years. Is that the right number? Okay. Yep. So that's a token, right? And it's once you have that, you can write to it. So that's valuable. So that gets stored in the middleware authorization API, right? So all of our tokens get stored in our middleware organization. They're responsible for managing that. That's, so that's down in here are our access tokens. So let's say at that point, you've got your SUNET connected to your ORCID. And I won't go into all the details of all that. There's a trusted relationship that you've established with ORCID when you set things up and got your client ID and secret issued, all that. So we've done that. We now have these tokens that are user specific. So there's a token somewhere in the Maze database for me, for my ORCID account. And I'll go to my profile and I will, let's say, add or approve a publication. And what Stanford Profiles does is it's really when you're adding and approving publications, you're talking to another system at Stanford University Library. And they're storing all that stuff in their system. Again, Stanford Profiles is just this portal to a lot of other systems on campus. So I'll add some publications into my profile. They'll end up showing up on my profile. And but they go into the Stanford University Library database. And over time, I've got a list of my approved publications over there in Stanford University Library. Every 2 days, the SUL runs a process, which then that's down here. So every 2 days, they will upload profile publications to ORCID. So they know, their Stanford Profiles and SUL are talking back and forth on a regular basis, sharing publications and active profiles. So they know who's eligible for publishing. Every 2 days they'll run. As they're running, so we have a general architecture across the university of, if you get an access token, you use it and you throw it away. You're not allowed to keep it. The only people that are allowed to store it, persist those, is the Maze database. And hopefully people can see me wiggling my pointer. So every 2 days, the SUL process runs. For me, as an example, it will call Maze, the REST API over here. The authorization API will ask for my access token. It gets it back. It'll take that publication that SUL has for me, write it to my ORCID profile. The response comes back with a put code. Since SUL is responsible for publications, they store it in their own database with their own put code. So our enterprise architecture is that if you wrote the data, you store the put code because you're the person who's going to update, modify, delete that data in the future. So SUL does that for publications. That's the general architecture. We'll do a couple screenshots here. This is what a user sees when they connect their SUNET ID to their ORCID. So when you go to authorize.stanford.edu, you get this web page here. You're trying to translate OAuth scopes, and that whole three-legged OAuth, you're trying to translate in a way that goes along with your messaging, right? Your messaging about what people are trying to approve. So as you can see this screen here, I believe the current incarnation, trying to make sure where we mentioned publications. So you're basically, by connecting the two, you're granting read access. This is the way we did it. And if you check the checkbox, you're granting write access. That's just the way we settled on this. So that gives, that translates to a number of scopes, which we then request over here. So you can see that we've, since I have the checkbox checked, allowing write access. Then you can see on this ORCID side that I have the read as well as an update to my, oh, is this not the bio slash, well, this is the personal, and then this is activities. I forget what that endpoint is because we're not using it. But anyway, so you do that, you authorize, I authorize Stanford to do this on my behalf. When I click that authorize button, a token goes back to Maze, and they store it in our secure token database. So that's that experience. This is a very small subset of what you see in Stanford profiles when you're editing your profile. So this is me as a super user looking at David Pollard's publications. The section where he could, at this point, this is his list of publications right here that he's currently got approved. Up here, you can see where he's already connected his ORCID. If you weren't connected yet, there'd be a call to action there, which would then redirect them over to the Stanford authorized site. You could click this update connection and he could go revoke write access, in which case a new token would be issued. And we would then lose the ability to upload publications or modify. There's a little asterisk there. We would lose for the most part, we would lose write access to his profile or his ORCID profile. And so, this is our user interface for, this has existed long before ORCID came along. And then, now it's just a matter of connecting it and then indicating what we want to upload. That's it for the Stanford profiles part. So he had connected this. So he connected his profile, all of his publications that were approved and public, within the next 48 hours. Sewell, their scheduled job, woke up. It knows that David's profile is public. It knows what publications what the status is. Like if he changes those check marks and hides things, Sewell would find out about it right away. And then on the next run, it will go and get David's token from Maze, bring that back, formulate the post to write a publication up to ORCID. So you can see here, over here in this work section, and I guess I don't know if I can highlight. I'm not going to figure that out on the fly. I'll just circle it with my mouse. We've got this publication here was added to his works section. The source is Stanford University. That's because we wrote it with our API key, and that's what gets listed underneath the source. That's that's the main parts of our architecture, at least for publications. That's what we've done thus far. Going forward into the future, we have this list of ideas and directions on the to-do list. And what I'm highlighting here is a couple of the items, where data comes from, whether it's authoritative or not. Let me just run down this list as an example. So we have institutional assertions, which are job titles. Those are, in this example here, it would come from our faculty affairs department. We would consider that authoritative data, right? So if Stanford writes it there, it's true because it's true in Stanford systems, right? Degrees would follow the same thing. We have a degree, it comes from the registrar, that's authoritative. We have education records that we also have in some of our systems that come from HR. For our physicians that come from the hospital, those are authoritative. Now we get to another one, which is education. We also have the ability for people to add education to their profile, right? So that's just me as a profiles user typing something in. So that's user data, right? It's not authoritative. It's not, I refer to it as it doesn't have a golden seal on it, or the special medal that says it's from Stanford. It was written, could have been written by Stanford, but it didn't necessarily come from Stanford. Next, we would move into the next one on the list, which is publications import. That's one where, that's on our to-do list. That's for like when new people come on to Stanford, you run into this issue with maybe they already have a full ORCID profile with 100 publications on it. It would be good to just be able to pull those in, right? So there's certain places where we would like to start doing the read and become a consumer, not a producer, but there's certain instances where you want to consume the data. And then that raises other questions, is it from an authoritative source? How do I use this? Is it duplicated? Lots of issues like that to be resolved. And then our last one is other data, right? There's so many other sections of ORCID, which are they get into a little bit of a more fuzzy or a gray line between authoritative and user data. And then how, we'll get to that on the next slide, but there's, all sorts of other things that we could be updating. And then that begs the question, should you be updating? And another can of worms. So on that note, this is kind of the list of questions that we have, which kind of, in addition to technical questions other people might have, this is questions we have as an organization. And I've alluded to some of them. The first one is, we are sometimes in a position where, how do you distinguish data when I'm looking at an ORCID profile as a consumer, or even as someone who's writing data up? How do you distinguish the data that you write up between data that's authoritative and data that's entered by a user, right? So in the case of Stanford right now, we write publications up to ORCID. The source is Stanford, but not all those publications were published by Stanford. Like, we don't know, we didn't, it's not a Stanford publication. It's a publication that a user put on their profile, right? And that's different than faculty affairs said this person has this job, right? So there's that, question. You have to figure out how you want to represent your organization on your API or on the ORCID profile where it says that little source. And then that's telling people in the outside world what that data means and how much you can trust it. Question number 2, once you have all this power to do everything to ORCID and you have all this data, how do you use the power? Right. So on the one hand, you can go down the path of fine-grained control. So Daryl, me as a profile owner, I should be able to pick and choose every single little item I want to share. Right. That's what you really want. And then what do people actually want to do? That's another thing, because picking every single little thing can be tedious and hard to get people to adopt. And then you can go you can go another route where there's a policy that says, we will publish all your data to ORCID as an organization. And then that is not usually well accepted by users, right? So there's this middle ground, that we all have to kind of culturally figure out where the comfortable area is. And the third question that we have is, in our example of pulling data down from ORCID, you run into this issue of, look, if I can see the source field, there's different in a sense, there's different grades of data that might be up there on ORCID, right? There's user supplied data, and then there's authoritative data, right? So in a sense, if I can see authoritative data from another organization, like, that's golden, right? I mean, I would love to take that stuff because we all kind of work together to be authoritative, stamp our data that's accurate. But how does ORCID get to the point where we have this sort of trust exchange, like where we know what sources are worth pulling from, what sources are maybe, how do we balance those? How do we let user data override trusted source data? Anyway, those are all open questions. I'm going to stop here. I know Zach Chandler's up there in the corner. So he's kind of our Dean of Research representative. So he's got way more input on the organizational decisions that are going into this. So Sheila, at that point, I will stop talking and hand it back to you.
Great, thanks, Daryl.
You want me to turn off this share?
I think it might be helpful to just leave this screen up so we can maybe kind of think together about these questions, because I think these are really good questions, and anybody who is either already writing data to ORCID or thinking about doing more or planning on doing it in the future, these are going to be questions that you might have. So I have some thoughts on these, but definitely want to open it up to everyone who's on the call. If anybody has additional kind of thoughts about any of these questions, you can go ahead and unmute, and you can also turn your video on if you'd like to do that. You have the permission to do that now. So anyone?
I'll jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to express my thanks to my team here in School of Medicine. Everybody needs a Daryl to actually pull something like this off. But to the rest of the community, I'll say that Sheila was incredibly helpful in our success and shaved a lot of time off. So definitely start by talking to Sheila about this. The starter kit app that ORCID provided let us get a running start. If we can all manage to marshal the resources to do this, institutional assertions about employment, if you think about it, can really have a very positive effect on the lived experience of researchers in terms of reducing administrative burden across the board. And this hits a lot of compliance topics and emerging policy topics as well. I see Lorianne Schultz is on the call, so she knows exactly what I'm talking about. But there may be some conversations we could have about what it means to have source equals University of Arizona. So I would love it if that were a really, authentic and authoritative statement that I could rely on, so that if I see somebody's ORCID coming in who wants to be a visiting scholar at Stanford, and their ORCID says that they really do have this job at University of Arizona, that I can just trust it, right? So I think that we might have to have a couple conversations about level setting on quality control before that happens, but it's kind of an exciting future. Also, this helps postdocs. So like your local record, at your university kind of dies when you leave, but ORCID's forever. So I think that we'll be doing a huge favor for our postdocs if we do this. And one other tip I wanted to give you about how we stood up that authorized portal. There were actually many different screens besides the ones that Daryl showed, depending on workflow state. And one of the things that we did well that we had a conversation about is how to word it in a way such that you can honor the rights of the user and researcher control of their own data, and still give you enough wiggle room to update stuff as your array of options expands. So we worked on that a little bit, so we can probably share with you all of that language.
Wonderful, thanks, Zach. Yeah, that's really, really helpful, and some really good points there. In terms of like the up and coming policies with the NSPM 33, federal funding agencies having to come up with some sort of policy that relates to the awardees or grant applicants having a digital persistent identifier, which is actually ORCID. Yeah, definitely writing data to your researchers' ORCID records is one of the main things that institutions can do to kind of help researchers prepare for those policies and save time in the long run. So thanks for bringing that up. I meant to mention that earlier. In terms of your comment about if all the institutions could at least write those employment affiliations, like that would be a wonderful starting point at least. So I agree. I think that's a great goal. And also to write employment, you don't necessarily need to have a custom integration. You could use the ORCID affiliation manager tool. So that's one thing for anyone on the call. If you're interested in doing that, definitely contact me and Paolo and we can make sure you can get set up with doing that. So great points there. And then in terms of, the second question on this slide, and trying to kind of have that balance between, like Zach mentioned, allowing the user or the researcher to still have full control over what's on their ORCID record, but also, as an institution, still being able to, do the actions you want to take, writing information to people's ORCID records. That's kind of really up to each institution. I'm not sure that there's really a kind of best practice around that as of right now, because you could set up your integration to just automatically add data to your users' ORCID records. And of course, you would want to let them know ahead of time that once you connect your ORCID ID to Stanford, we're going to just add as much information about you as we have to ORCID. You could choose to do that, and then users can always delete those entries or change the visibility setting of each of those entries if they didn't want that information to be public for whatever reason. So you could go that route, or the workflow that you already have in place where you're basically giving each user the option to select which items they want to have added to their ORCID record. I mean, that I think is a really great approach as well. And as long as your users are actually taking that action, I think that's wonderful as well. And we've seen both, just out there in either vendor systems or custom integrations too. So I don't know if anybody has any kind of additional input or thoughts on that aspect or any of these other questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Interject one thing on, I think in a future from now, when there are more sources contributing to ORCID, I think at that point in time, the data that's up there is a lot richer, and you have much less need to write data, as much data, right? So like in our example, we're writing all of the publications because we have them and people wanted to seed their ORCIDs because they're sparse right now. But in a future, you could certainly see that things are getting published, and all the publishers are writing to all the authors' records, and there's no need for Stanford to put this up there. It's ripe for the picking. So in some future where people are contributing, and it's more, your third-party sources, now it's riper, it's more ripe for pulling data in, and there's less need for us to put up non-authoritative data. But that's a different place than where we are now, and that we get there through certain
Yes.
through a certain path.
I think that is the direction things are moving, but probably a little more slowly than we would all like.
Yeah, but I mean,
and another example is like the funding section of ORCID records. Many institutions have information about who got what funding, and if that's curated and trustworthy, you can add that to your researchers' ORCID records. But ideally, the funders would be adding that information to have it be even more authoritative. So yes, it's definitely an ecosystem with multiple types of organizations having a role to play, for sure. Any other thoughts? I'm keeping an eye on the time as well. I feel like we could really talk about all of this all day, or I could. Okay, so if you do have thoughts, feel free to just chime in and interrupt me, because I could really talk about this all day. The kind of the first and the third questions here, in terms of, you know, you're basically, Stanford is basically taking it kind of at face value, like, oh, this researcher said that this publication is theirs. Let's go ahead and add that to their ORCID record. You know, the other option is the user just goes ahead and adds that to their own ORCID record themselves. So, you know, I think, again, that's kind of per institution, it's kind of up to you in terms of like, how much do you trust your researchers? Because yeah, ORCID does not have a mechanism that kind of double checks to make sure everything is that is being stated is accurate. So again, I don't think there's really kind of a best practice on that. It's just at your institution, you know, what level of confidence do you have that your researchers, what they're saying is accurate? And then same thing for like the third question, if you're pulling data in from somebody's ORCID record, I believe when you do a read call through the API, you do get the source of that data. So you could set something up to kind of filter through. But again, it's kind of like, how much do you trust the accuracy of the information that people have maybe added to their own ORCID record? So, and I'm kind of thinking like, if somebody is spending that much time entering all of their information into their ORCID record, I don't know. I don't really know what to say about that, but it is possible to get that source. So if you did want to use the source of that data as an indicator of trustworthiness, you could do that. But again, it's like, how much do you trust your researchers? So I think these are questions that maybe don't necessarily have definitive answers right now, but that we can all be kind of thinking about. And as more institutions start writing data to ORCID, we can maybe kind of focus around some sort of shared approach or best practice.
For us, I think we decided there's a built-in incentive for researchers not to overstate their contribution to science, and that you know, a Stanford professor would never put a publication on their Stanford profile that they didn't write. So we also have we didn't talk a whole lot about the harvester, but the Stanford library system harvests from Web of Science, PubMed, and other systems, and then recommends based on like name matching. So this is kind of, you know, not as good as ORCID, of course, which is completely unambiguous. But we have an inbox in the Stanford profile system where like, we think these are you. Check check if it's true and submit. So there's a human interaction for them to actually claim their publications. That's an assertion. So it's a really great like signal to noise ratio in terms of being favorable. Like it's a very clean signal. A lot of these people don't have hardly any publications in their ORCID record, not nearly as many as in Stanford profiles. We had about a bank of about 300,000 publications sitting there. So this is a chance for us to take all that haranguing of faculty that we did to get them to keep their Stanford profile up to date. Like, you know, let's not ask them to do that twice, right? So we want to reduce admin burden. So then for every publication that actually has a DOI, some didn't, like the hand-entered ones and so on, shipping all that to ORCID is just like a really great starter kit. And, you know, we might do it differently in the future, but we feel pretty confident in putting source equals Stanford in there because of the various, like, you know, human interventions and that sort of reputational harm that they would incur if they were to overstate their contributions.
And I should clarify when I say, you know, when I've got the word trust in there, it's more like, what is the quality of this data, right? Not whether or not it's true, but do I understand where it came from such that I can make decisions? Because you're left with these deduping problems, and you have to have this precedence over who wins, right? And then that's really kind of based on your, what I'm calling, you know, trust of the data, right? You know, which one is the better source? So that it's kind of that level of trust.
Yes, absolutely. I realize that we have about 3 minutes left, and we had some questions earlier in the chat that I want to make sure we address. But also, if everyone wants to continue these discussions, we do have a thread in our discussion forum that I put a link to here specifically about writing data to ORCID. So feel free to post in there, or send an email to myself and Paolo, and we can post in there on your behalf, just to keep this discussion going, because I think it's really valuable, and hopefully people are getting a lot from it. So the URL, you have to be logged in. Maybe there is a typo here. Let's try this. This will take you to the most recent posting. Try that. So if you can stay on, that would be great. If you have to go, I completely understand. While I'm talking about these next questions, I have a second poll just to kind of gauge how helpful this call has been. And if it wasn't very helpful for you, definitely contact us, because we can talk through more of the details. I realize this is a lot of information. One of the questions we got earlier in the chat was, is there an estimate of development effort and time needed to build these custom integrations? That really depends on the staff expertise and staff time that you have available, whether your developer is already familiar with OAuth or not, what other projects you might have going on. So it's really hard to give just like a definitive answer. Some organizations we've worked with have been able to get their integration kind of up and running within a few weeks. Others, it takes several months. It just really depends. So again, contact us and we can help you figure that out for your scenario. And then another question was, what does a custom integration afford that a vendor solution may lack? And that's really just more like flexibility. So with a vendor system, you're really kind of locked into whatever the vendor system, the data that they have available and that they can write to ORCID. With a custom integration, you can choose, you have a lot more flexibility about what type of data you want to write to ORCID, the workflows, whether you want your users to do the selection process or have it just be automatic. And also some of the vendor systems might not have the data that you are wanting to write to ORCID. So there's a little bit more flexibility with a custom integration. The expiration time for access tokens is 20 years by default. And then user control of information. If a user deletes a record that was entered by an institution, is the institution alerted to the deletion? So would a funder be able to identify that information had been deleted? I don't think so. No, that's just kind of up to that user, whether they want that information on their ORCID record or not. I can double check that, but I believe that you would not get a notification if somebody deleted an item that you added to their ORCID record. So
there are webhooks. Is there a webhook for that? Or is it not going to be related?
Okay, that's a great point, Daryl. So yeah,
I don't remember. I'm just bringing that up.
If you have a webhook, if you have webhooks registered on each ORCID ID, you will get a notification anytime something on their ORCID record has changed. So I'm assuming that would include the deletion, a deletion of data. Webhooks, the use case is more like if something new got added to their ORCID record and you want to pull that into your profiles or whatever system you have. So that's a good question, and I'll look more into that and include that in the notes. Yeah. Any other last thoughts or questions? I know we're slightly over time. Thank you all so much for joining the call today. And we'll share the slides and the recording in the notes after.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much again, Tina, Daryl, Zach, and the whole Stanford team. And thanks everyone for attending. Let's see. I'm going to end the poll. Oh, good. It looks like most people found the call at least somewhat helpful, if not extremely helpful. So thank you for your feedback, everyone. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank you.
much. Bye.
Bye.